Yo, good afternoon to all the people in the world. Garrett Sussman here with Michael King. We are ready to rock. And what are we talking about today, Mike? Some like small
Something
SEO
happened with Google. I don't know. Something.
I don't. Probably not a big deal.
Yeah,
we are hyped.
I mean, it's the thing I've been talking about the most. Obviously, the algorithm documentation leak from last month at this point.
Dude, the last 4 or 5 weeks have been absolutely nuts, and we are so excited to dive into it. We're going to cover so many different aspects, stuff Mike's published, stuff Mike hasn't published. I hate to admit it. I'm sorry, folks, but we're not going to give you everything. We're keeping a few things close to the chest. No, I mean there is stuff, Mike. Would you say there's stuff that we're already working on with clients that isn't necessarily, we don't, no one publishes everything.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot in there, right? I think there's going to be things that are mined out of there for months to come. I think people are going to find other things and then learn how important certain things in there that aren't like described well are. And, it's going to be a gift that keeps on giving. But at the same time, there have been, new tactics. There have been tactics that we've been recommending for a while that we have more ammunition to get buy-in for. And so, it's just a treasure trove of information for anyone who's like actually serious about doing SEO. So I think that there's just so much that we haven't even discovered yet that's going to come up. Like very few people have talked about the YouTube stuff in there. Very few people have talked about, all the entity stuff. So there's just a lot that we can learn from that over time.
Okay, so welcome everyone. Hope everyone can see us. Looks good. Elio, Stefan, Matthew, Brittany, what's up, friends? Let's dive in. We've got a lot to cover.
Hold up. Where's everybody watching us from? Chime in, let us know so we can know that I'm not just like talking to my computer.
I am from Northern Virginia, where it is so freaking hot. I walked my dog earlier. I need to get her a haircut. She is just a fluff right now. How's it in Brooklyn?
It's hot, but I don't go outside, so.
Oh man, we got international. Oh, actually, that reminds me. So a few folks did kind of write in and say, you guys start stuff too late, get it earlier for us European folks. Mike's doing the tour. Where are you going to be in a couple months, Mike?
I'll be out there in Germany. I'm be in Berlin, Munich, Hamburg. I'm also going to be in Amsterdam and Vienna. I'm going to be a lot of places.
Well, welcome everyone. I was hitting you from Phoenix. I shouldn't talk. Ben's repping Philly. I shouldn't talk if Phoenix is in the house. Texas, yeah, Matthew. Okay, so Tampa. Okay, so now I feel like a jerk saying it's hot in Northern Virginia. You have people in Phoenix and Texas and all of that. Let's talk some Google League stuff. So once upon a time, we're a little storytelling for you. Google's Rosetta Stone fell into the hands of SEOs. Mike, why don't you give us the whole breakdown of this story to set the stage for what we're diving into?
All right, cool. So here's what happened, right? I was at this art thing for my kids. I was at their school, and then Rand pings me. He's like, Mike, I got these documents. I think it might be, some documentation from Google and how search works. And so I rush home, get on Google Meet, and then Rand is like showing me all this stuff. And I'm like, yo, this looks real, like it looks like something that's actually internal documentation. And so he had said that he had got it from someone who was, at the time a bit anonymous. And then he's like, yo, help me go through this so we can break this story and dig into it and understand what's going on. So this was Memorial Day weekend, which I was already scheduled to like be hanging out with my kids pretty heavily. Every free moment I got, I was like back on this documentation, trying to figure out what was going on. And so I think that Friday I had tweeted something vague. I was like, yeah, I'm about to set SEO internet on fire next week. And, my guy, Dan Petrovic, who initially did not want to be introduced as part of this conversation, told me that he had already found this 3 weeks prior, and he had already been like digging into all the data, and he had collated it in a variety of ways. So then, I do my analysis. I give Rand some stuff. He's doing some analysis on his side as well. He's writing his blog post. I'm writing mine. I'm like, cool. But you got to let me publish first. And so I did that. And then he published his immediately afterwards. So it was no difference at all who published it. And then, things just went crazy, right? Like everyone wanted to talk about it. Everyone has their input on it, their insights on what they think it is. And for me, it's been a really good opportunity to better understand the things that I've been learning through all the research I've been doing for my book. So it's better understanding how Google works and getting more understanding of the internal systems, the ranking systems as they are from like a development perspective, not from the high level abstract level that we typically talk about them. So yeah, it's been a really eye-opening experience.
And like, as I mentioned, like just going through it, it's funny. I have the privilege of sharing a couple of Slack channels with Mike, and he'll drop like stuff that he's into or that he's found out or discovered. And so it is ongoing. Got a little Willy Wonka situation, like, in that scene in Willy Wonka where they're going and they're checking out where the everlasting gobstopper's made. And he's like, this is top secret, like do not steal any of the formula as well. We kind of got one of those going on right now. So we'll let some clients behind the doors, but if you're interested, you want to do that whole strategy thing, you know who to talk to. So why does all this matter? And before we dive in, kind of let's talk in about some of the caveats. And there will be a replay. We'll send this out with the deck after this is all said and done. Mike, caveats?
Yeah, I mean, it's the ingredients, it's not the recipe. I like to think of this as us just understanding the components that Google may be using to feed into the scoring functions or algorithms as we know it. And so it's just really telling us a lot of the different features that they're extracting from pages, that they're modeling off of pages. And again, just giving us more clarity on what they're thinking about. We've always, known it as like, 200 ranking signals or ranking factors, but really there are many more aspects or attributes that are being weighed here. And as far as how current this data is, this is also something that was debated pretty heavily. Frankly, I think by people that just don't understand how development works and things like that. Based on the dates, we're seeing references as late as 2023, but there's also some markers in there where they're talking about things like LLMs and so on. So, either way, it's pretty recent, even if we're only going by the dates that are in there. But based on what you see in the commit history, the commit for this was, when they updated it was on May 7th, which again aligns with when Dan turned it into Google to say like, hey, you guys have a problem. He got a bug bounty off of it. But yeah, then they pushed out, the original set that we're looking at back in March. So, it's most likely very recent data that we're looking at here.
Yeah, and to that point, we'll set more context of the information that we all get when we're talking twiddlers and protocol buffers and all that. Again, very technical. But what are we working with?
Yeah, so we've got almost 2,600 modules in the documentation. So think of it as like 2,600 pages that are representing different components of these ingredients. And then we have 14,014 attributes or features that are represented in here. And so one of the things that someone had said at one point is like, oh, it's everything. We don't know how much of it is search. And so what I did is I went through and segmented the different attributes based on the naming convention of the modules. And so as you can see here, they're mostly search, but there's also stuff from assistant, maps, and so on. And that's why I'm saying that there's value in digging into this beyond search, because there are things that we can learn about YouTube and, apps and assistant and things of that nature.
To that point, voice search is making a comeback. So, but actually with all the AI stuff, we do actually have to pay attention. There might ultimately be stuff in assistant that's really interesting.
Yep.
Let's bust some myths. What were the Googlers saying? And this isn't like a pile on. they're all really good people, but we are dealing with, they're in a tough spot where they have to, represent and communicate on behalf of an organization with a lot of proprietary secrets, and things get said and they get held accountable.
Yeah, I've been reading in the Plex lately, and they talk about it as their like hiding strategy. But in any event, we have heard them say a number of times that we don't have anything like domain authority, but then you find that there's an attribute called site authority, and then there's also just a variety of different measures in there that they're using that kind of align with what domain authority is doing. So this idea that they are using your homepage page rank and associating that with any page on the website is effectively very similar to an idea of domain authority. So there's just a lot of evidence in there that they are looking at things from a site-wide perspective when Google has historically said that they don't. This is probably the one that we've heard the most. We don't use clicks for rankings, and there are several attributes in there that talk about how they use clicks for rankings. So the main idea here is that a successful session is a function of what's called a long click. So a click where someone basically clicks on a result and then doesn't come back to Google because they found what they were looking for, and there's no need for them to go back to Google. They don't need to go look at another result. And this is a specific area of contention in our space because people still believe that this is not a thing, which is completely ridiculous to me. But specifically, we saw that, Googlers have looked to discredit people like Rand Fishkin, who have been doing all these experiments and showcasing live that this is actually something that Google is doing. So yeah, they definitely use clicks for rankings. And going back to In the Plex, the book I've been reading, they explicitly talk about this idea of the long click and how they use clicks across all Google products to determine whether or not people are actually having a good time with what they're using. So, we can find all the patents, we can find all the leaks and so on, but they've already explicitly said it to us in a book.
And I actually have a quick question. Do you think they tie that to queries and the expectations of what a specific click should look like for it? Because obviously, if you're just looking for a feature snippet type of info, you don't even need to leave Google. If you're looking for a calculator, that's an experience. If you're looking for a deep dive, that's going to be a different experience. Do you think it understands that?
Yeah, I think they think of session success in a variety of ways, right? Like I think one component of it is, does the user leave Google and not come back? Then there's a component of, does the user come back, perform another search, and then realize like, hey, this result was the one I clicked on before on the other search, and then they go there. So if that happens, then both of those end up being a success, even though the first one looks like it wasn't. So I think that this is like a multivariate thing. It's not just like, oh, you clicked on it and then you close the browser or something like that. That could be considered a success for a query like, what time is the Super Bowl or whatever. So I think it has to be a multivariate thing. It's not just like, did you click or did you not click? And then they talk about there being no sandbox, and this idea where a new site has the same power of an old site to rank, but explicitly we have something in there called host age, and it mentions that the data is used with a Twiddler to sandbox fresh spam in serving time, which is basically an indication that like this site is not old enough for us to rank it well, which is by definition a sandbox. Google has said that they don't use Chrome for ranking at all. But then we find a attribute called Chrome in total, which is described as site level Chrome views. Why would you track that if you're not going to use it? And then also there's a design document that leaked back in 2019 for something called real-time boost, which is just a mechanism that they use for ranking in news. And they indicated that like, hey, Chrome visits were coming soon to this. So again, we have two instances where it's saying that they are using Chrome data for rankings.
And this feels more controversial, but also, just we're all paying attention to the antitrust trial from the DOJ against Google and how all this plays out. There's even more info there, kind of validating this too.
Yeah. So there's been a lot that we've uncovered with Google's actual ranking systems, really their naming. And then as you read through, you see that like certain things do certain things, right? And I think it's really valuable just to understand that this abstraction layer that we talk about Google on is not actually how it works. And so here's an example, right? Like when we talk about the index, I think we all think of it as though it's just like some database, right? It's not. It's a series of things, series of different systems that they will collect documents from during this process. So, as an example, like we talk about the index being stratified in 3 different layers: one that lives in memory, one that lives on solid state drives, and one that lives on like hard drives, right? And that in and of itself is really valuable to understand because Google treats links that live in those different aspects differently. So if you live in memory, those are considered pages that get crawled a lot, or those are pages that end up getting crawled a lot, pages that rank well, and also pages that get more traffic. And so those pages are the ones that end up having more value as far as link equity that they can flow to other sites and so on. So having an understanding of that tells you that the way that we've been building links, just going after volume and not thinking about traffic, has been wrong all along. And so, there's a great post from Andrew Ansley where he like kind of digs into this in more detail and looks at how everything is related to each other. And I definitely recommend that folks check that out.
And one thing, speaking of the memory, I know we'll talk about a little bit more later, but the idea that Google is saving different versions of the website, which might play into their rankings as well. Like it's not just whatever your current version is.
Yeah, and it's this idea that you can't really trick Google by making changes to your site because they're going to compare against it. There's indications that it's like the last 20 versions of your URL to make determinations on like, okay, are you spamming and things like that. And it really speaks to like, some of these other things that we've uncovered in here, but I want to save those for when we get there. Now, there's also, for me, I got a better understanding of how Panda works because I'd already done a lot of research and understood like the patents for Panda. And when Panda rolled out, like there was just a lot of confusion in the SEO space. And everyone was like, well, how do we recover? Is it machine learning? Like what's going on here? But the more that we've learned about Nav Boost, the more we get an understanding of how Panda worked. So Panda was effectively what's called a modification factor. And think of it as like a multiplier that's added to your score or, used as part of your score. So imagine your score starts out at like 100 and then you get this multiplier that's a function of what are called, independent links or linking root domains and reference queries. Now, imagine that is one linking root domain divided by 25 reference queries. Well, that score that you had that was 100 is now 4. And so because of that, you no longer had the ability to rank, even though nothing changed about your website. Now, those reference queries are what comes from NavBoost. So basically queries that were successful for your web page or successful for your subdirectory or successful for your domain. And so what Google does is they compute the NavBoost reference queries on a 28-day rolling window. So if you were making a bunch of changes in your website, you wouldn't see an immediate impact because Google has to collect that data over time and then adjust this modification factor. And so if you didn't rank and you weren't going to rank because you were already demoted because of this, you may not rank again because the reference queries didn't really change. And so it wasn't necessarily machine learning. It was really just these user signals, 2 different user signals, one, which is the links, because you don't have complete control over that. And then 2, what the users were actually clicking on. Now, I think this is like really valuable for us to understand because, for all this time, we were all questioning whether or not click activity had any impact. But now we know definitively that it does. And that with Google rolling in Panda into the core algorithm, this can be something that is impacting us like day to day that we weren't really even thinking of before. So there's this other thing called a twiddler, right? So when we talk about the core algorithm, that's something that was historically called a scorer. It's called a scorer because it was named after Amit Singhal, the guy who used to run Google search, who basically rewrote, almost single-handedly rewrote the algorithms that Larry and Sergey had initially built. And so that's the core of the ranking mechanism. But then you have these things that live outside of it that are just basically bolt-ons that are called twiddlers. And so what they can do is adjust the score for a document or adjust the position. And there's a variety of different types of twiddlers, and you can see in this flow chart, to indicate like which way do you want to go. You want to improve SERP usability, well, also improve diversity or whatever. Then you want to do a stride twiddler. But a lot of the twiddlers that we know of are the ones that are in the boost categories. And so nav boost is one of those, quality boost is another. They've also got real-time boost and web image boost. And so this is really good for us to understand, because when Google says things like, oh yeah, we have this update, and then we roll it into the core algorithm, this is what they're talking about effectively. They're saying, yeah, we built this thing that's basically like a plugin, like a WordPress plugin on top of the algorithm. And then we've now made that part of the core of WordPress.
And to clarify, these are in addition to the weight factors. Like, so we keep saying we don't know the weights of all the different factors. Those are part of the core algorithm, but the twiddlers, the boosts, are independent of those weights.
Yes. So imagine the core algorithm is like one equation, and then there's a value that comes out of that equation. And then these twiddlers can adjust the values.
Yep. I'm with you.
So protocol buffers, I think these are also interesting to understand, because it is the data structure effectively that Google is using across all this stuff, right? And, there's lots of different data structures that are out there. Like the most common one across the web is JSON, but protocol buffers is just like one that was specifically invented at Google that allows them to make their data pretty modular and plug into, whatever else that they're trying to do.
Let's get into the meat. Let's do this.
All right, cool. So yeah, SEO should be more experiment driven. And I think historically, when we talk about experiments in SEO, we're talking about like bigger websites, sites that have, thousands of pages on a given template. So you can make an adjustment and do like an A/B test, basically. I think that everyone should be doing some level of experimentation, no matter how big your site is. And it comes down to a lot of these features that we've identified here. I think everyone should be continually doing page title testing and meta description testing, and, making adjustments to your UX to keep people on these pages so that you can send back better signals to Google, indicating like, hey, this is a good, successful session for this keyword. And so structuring tests, I think that someone asked, how do you identify twiddlers? You can't. Like, we don't have that visibility on a day-to-day ranking level. That's just something that they can tell us about when they say like, hey, we've got a new penguin update, or a new named update is often one of these twiddlers. It's not always, but it often is. Like when we're talking about them rolling out Panda or Penguin or something like that, and they talk about it being, outside of the core algorithm, that would be a representation of a twiddler. Now, as far as the structuring the SEO tests, I mean, it's like anything else, right? Like you want to have a hypothesis first. And again, I think this is where this leak is very valuable, because we can have smarter hypotheses based on this look under the hood on the site. And then you want to figure out like, how are we evaluating this? So what are the KPIs that indicate success? Is it just improvements in traffic, improvements in rankings, improvements in click-throughs? And then you want to figure out like what variables you want to impact. So if we're talking about page titles, do we want to make them longer than the standard 60, 70 characters? Do we want to make them shorter? Do we want to put the primary keyword in the back rather than the front? You probably don't want to do that, but that's just like a thing that we can test. And then once we have a clarity on what those are going to be, plan that out, execute on it, and then report on it to see how well it did, do a bit more analysis, like digging into it. So you can see, also comparing against what other competitors are doing as well, if you're seeing any fluctuation in their performance, and then using that to go back to the top of this to, use additional hypotheses. Now, as far as test duration, it's completely a function of how often Google is crawling your site. And this is why I've long been a proponent of pulling in log data when doing split testing, because you would let a test ride, but you don't necessarily know if Google re-indexed that page in that time frame, and whether or not they actually are showing your changes. So typically people run it for 30 days. But again, if you have a site that is not getting, let's say you have like a 1 million page site and Google is indexing or crawling, 100 URLs a day, that 30 days isn't going to be enough, obviously. So you want to make sure that you are reviewing your logs and ensuring that they have an opportunity to re-index those pages. Also, what we tend to do is put all the URLs that have changed into a single sitemap and then submit that, because Google looks at what are called differential sitemaps as ones that they prioritize. So if you have, a bunch of URLs in a sitemap and it's your core sitemap, but then you create another sitemap that's like, let's say it's 5,000 URLs, Google's going to crawl that one first, because they're like, okay, something is likely changed here. And so when you put all your change URLs in one sitemap, that increases the likelihood that they're going to crawl those quicker and then re-index those pages quicker. So there's a number of tools out there. SearchPilot kind of invented the space. You can do this yourself using spreadsheets. Obviously, those are free. It's a long-held thing that people say in SaaS, that you're not competing with other products, you're competing with Google Sheets, basically. And so SearchPilot is typically more for the enterprise-focused folks. Again, they invented the space, so they're kind of like best in class for the solutions. And they're doing things server-side rather than client-side. A lot of these tools are doing things client-side, which is fine, but Google doesn't always render your page, and so they may not see your tests. And again, there isn't enough of a feedback loop to indicate that they have rendered the page when they crawl it. So you may not see Google indexing those tests when they're client side. But then there's also SEOtesting.com. That one is, more on the lower tier as far as like pricing and things like that. And if you just want to get your feet wet with testing, definitely check that out.
One thing I just want to call out, at the end of next month, we're actually going to do a secondary webinar to go even deeper on testing with Will Critchlow of SearchPilot. We haven't officially announced it, but keep your eyes peeled if you really want that step-by-step, because to Mike's point about SearchPilot, they introduce so many different of the other factors that are very hard to control and create like probabilities around whether or not your tests are actually meaningful. So Will's going to kind of walk us through a lot of that. It'll be really cool.
Yeah. All right. So let's dig into some of these features. So one is the last significant update. So they are measuring, when they crawl the page, did it change significantly? So if you're someone that's just like changing dates, that may not be enough. They are looking at me like, okay, only one thing changed here, or maybe, the ads changed on this page or whatever it is. And they're measuring that, and they use that to determine how often they should crawl your pages. So if you want to test this, you could do exactly that. Just change the dates and then see what happens. And then you could also change the date and add a new section. And then you can figure out like, what is the threshold of change that's required for Google to start crawling you more often. And so the hypothesis here would really be, what is considered a significant update. And your controls could be like, okay, we changed nothing, of course. And then, one variable could be just changing the date, and then the other could be changing the date and the adding the section. And the metrics you'd look at there would be primarily the crawl frequency, and then secondarily changes in keyword rankings.
And to that point, I should call out. So what we're doing now is we're walking through a bunch of the features that Mike's identified from the leak and how you potentially could test those. But there's infinite, if you're watching Dark Matter right now, there are infinite different possibilities when it comes to the different tests that you can roll out for your own site.
Yep. So we also saw that authors are an explicit feature. And what I mean by that is there's been a lot of talk over the years about things like agent rank, author rank, and so on. And there's also just been some confusion as to, is Google actually doing this, right? Which, from my perspective, never made sense, right? You've always had people like the late, great Bill Slawski, who was digging into the patents and showing like, hey, this is something that Google has always been looking to do. AJ Cohn, of course, he was highlighting this. But Google has also evolved beyond just what we're seeing here, where it's like, oh, what's the name of this author? Google is modeling embeddings on the website level. And so this way they can determine like, what is this site best talking about? What is it an expert on? What are the topic areas? And then compare that to new pages and compare it to other sites as well. And they're doing the same thing on the author level too. So they have author vectors or author embeddings that are representing authors. So effectively, they're able to say, okay, well, Michael King from iPullRank, he writes on all these different places, and he's an expert on these subjects based on how they've modeled all my content that they see with my name on it. And so once they can do that, they can apply that to a variety of things across the web. So if you want to test what the impact of an author is, you can do a control where there's no author. You can compare that against a generic author. So things like, the iPullRank team versus like an actual person. And then you can have an expert author where you've got all the standard EEAT stuff where you're linking out to their social profiles, where they're writing and things of that nature, so that Google has an easier time of collecting all that stuff and associating it with the same author. I mentioned this earlier, where you sit in the index impacts the value of a link. And again, I think this is a really important thing that should change fundamentally how all link building is done. Because, we've historically just gone after link volume, because you look at another site and you say like, oh, they have 100 links that are an average DA of 40. Let me get 120 links with an average DA of 50. Yeah, that works. But you know what else can work? 5 links from pages that actually drive traffic. And so you see here, they have type high quality, type medium quality, type low quality, and then they also have type fresh docs. So these are all just functions of like where they live in the index. And, the things that live in the higher tier of the index are also the higher quality pages from Google's perspective. Now, if you wanted to test this, I wouldn't necessarily recommend testing it on your core sites. Spin up a test site. And those are so easy to do now with the advent of generative AI. And then build some links to them, looking at links that are, the ones that are high traffic driving, which is data you can get from Ahrefs. And in fact, what we've done is we've built a composite metric where we look at UR, DR, rankings, and then also the traffic to a given page. And we model that out to a score so that we can compare side by side which of these links is going to be better based on measures that Google is likely also using, or is definitely also using based on what we've got here. And so anything that's going to be at 80 to 100 would be high quality, 50 to 79 would be mid quality, then 49 and lower would be low quality. And so, yes, you're going to move the needle if you get enough of the low quality links, which is what everyone does. But again, if you go after fewer of those very, very high quality links, and I'm defining quality as a function of rankings and traffic, not just the standard how many links does it get, then you're going to see higher value. So if you get more of those links to your test site, you will likely see those pages improve faster than if you did a bunch of like links from some of these lower quality services that drive no traffic. So they also have some indications of how they look at link velocity to determine whether or not you're spamming. So what I like to highlight is that it says over how many days 80% of these phrases were discovered. So meaning like, what is the timetable in which they found these links? And if you suddenly see, 100,000 links using the same anchor text, Google can easily be like, cool, let's discount that. And so based on that, when we talk about the idea of negative SEO, not to say that it's impossible, it's just very difficult because Google is actively looking for this as things that kind of, trip a filter that just says, okay, we're just not going to count these. It's not necessarily that we're going to count them negatively. We're just going to discount that they exist. Now, as we mentioned before, Google's index works more like the Wayback Machine. And so they have copies of your pages forever. But the data indicates that, they compare the last 20 versions of the page. So if you're trying to like get rid of something, you're going to have to make 20 updates before they stop. Well, make and get indexed 20 significant updates before they stop considering something that you had on that page.
Well, we have a test for that. It's coming up a little later too.
Yeah. And also back to this idea that Google is looking at these site level metrics and applying them. Well, the homepage PageRank is associated with every page. And also the homepage trust, they have a measurement of trust for your homepage that they're applying to every page as well. So Google does still use PageRank, but they have multiple versions of PageRank. There was a PageRank, like a standard one. There's a PageRank 2, which is not defined. And then there's a PageRank NS. NS stands for nearest seed. And there's a whole series of patents where they talk about, how close are pages to a seed set of trusted pages. So Google is leveraging that to determine, how much do we trust this page? And they're associating it with every page across your site. And there have been discussions of how toxic backlinks aren't a thing, and that's only something that was made up by the SEO space to sell software. But they explicitly have something in there called bad backlinks penalized. So it's definitely something that Google is looking at and something you definitely want to mitigate for, irrespective of what they've told us in the past.
And to that point, can you differentiate between the spam velocity and toxic backlinks? Like, it's not just a quantity thing. There's a specific attribute there.
Yeah, so it looks like they have a system called bad backlinks, which may be a function of, RankBrain or any of these other systems that we've heard of or SpamBrain that is identifying what a bad link is. And so once a link is identified as bad, like that is just something it continues to carry. It doesn't seem like they go back and say like, oh, it's not bad anymore. It's like once it's bad, right? And so in our space, we should be continuing to look for that, even though the disavow links tool is going away. You still want to get an understanding of what might be considered a bad link, because if you have a bunch of those, it may be a signal to Google that like, oh, you are also a bad site. You don't want to be on the bad site list because there's some indication that once you get there, that is always associated with your site.
Oof. Talks about buying domains, which we'll get to as well.
Yeah. So this is a bit of a funny one to me because, I've been in SEO since back when you would bold every instance of your target keyword on the page, or you would italicize it or whatever, because those are all different semantic signals to indicate to Google, like this is a important aspect of the page. And so they look at the font size of terms in the document, and they're also looking at the font size of links. So, if you want to test that, you could. You could certainly make your internal links bigger than what else is on the page. But I suspect that this is more an opportunity for people to add other elements to the page that have anchor text to it. So as an example, a button that's, bigger than the rest of the text or something like that. But, I wouldn't be surprised if people started just like making all the internal links like 20 pixels when the text is like 12. I don't recommend that, but I suspect that is something that would change the weight of the value of those links on the page.
That's the other theme through all this is like, please experiment responsibly. Like, don't run an experiment that's going to do potentially do serious damage to your site. There's one experiment I threw up there, and Mike was like, "Nah, no, we can't have that in there because it's like, if it's done to your core site, then it would, really screw up your, any future rankings, all that." So, if you have any questions, that is another reason to get in touch with an expert or Mike or us or whoever before you just run some of these that might be risky.
Wait, you said an expert or Mike? Am I not?
Sorry, let me rephrase. The expert or an expert. Guys, did I recover? Did I recover?
Are you turning red?
I'm always red. That's you don't know this about me. No.
Okay, so yeah, documents also get truncated, and this is something that has kind of been historically true because early search engines didn't do full text search, and so they would just index the page title because it was just too resource or storage intensive to store all these pages. And Google doesn't necessarily have that problem now, but there is an indication that in here that they are truncating documents to a certain number of tokens as required. So what you want to do is make sure the most important things are at the top of the page, and so you can operate in a variety of ways with this. You can, add your important content to the top. You can make your content shorter. You can try a variety of different approaches to see what makes a difference. Because if there are instances where Google is saying like, okay, we're not even going to consider past a certain component of the page, well, then your page doesn't necessarily need to be that long. So there's also indications later on where the originality of short content is considered pretty heavily as well. So they have a blog Copycat score, which you briefly saw that we were calling the Neil Patel score. And really, Google is looking for the originality of content so that they can effectively boost it. And we talk about this in a variety of ways in our space. More lately, people have been talking about information gain, but even before that, they're trying to figure out like, is this net new as compared to other pages? And so this specifically says like, okay, pages that have little content, let's try to boost those if it's incredibly original stuff. So again, we can talk about like, okay, let's try shorter content rather than making everything long form. And one other thing I want to mention is there was something that Amit Singhal worked on back in the day prior to him coming to Google, because he was like a hardcore information retrieval guy before Google. And it's a thing called pivoted document normalization. Because what they found was a longer document will always outrank a shorter document because there's just more to it. And so to some degree, and again, this is more on the recipe side, not the ingredient side, they were probably always, just looking for ways to make content modeled in a shorter way so that it's better compared to shorter content. So I say all that to say, you don't have to just do long form content. You can create shorter things and have them rank well. And again, you can test this out in a variety of ways by generating shorter content, making content shorter by like obfuscating certain parts of it and just seeing what works.
You made a reference to the recipe versus the thing. I thought you were making a recipe site joke there in terms of long content that ranks.
I wish all recipe sites were shorter.
Ooh, page titles.
Yeah, so page titles still measured against the queries as you would imagine. They have a title match score. And so what you would want to do is test to see, okay, what's going to make a difference, right? Like, we have found that page titles don't have to be the length that we've always talked about them being in SEO. We have tested a number of times where we've added more of the keywords at the end of the page title, and it could be, over 100 characters. And to the credit of the Googlers, they have said, and there's documentation that says there is no hard length that we're looking for, but they will rewrite things. And so when you give it more text, it has more to choose from when it rewrites. And so you can test it by, doing shorter ones, longer ones, and just see what happens.
Let alone, I remember during title getting there were like times where it was pulling from other H1s or not even the title tag at one point. I think they kind of fixed that though.
Well, in their official documentation, they say that it can be pulled from the H1, from other elements on the page. But to your point, I typically see it H1 or something in the title itself. And there's no character counting measures on that stuff. Like they talk about how many tokens are in a page title, but aside from this, the snippet prefix character count, there isn't anything that says the character limit is this. So it seems like, because when we look in the wild, there's a lot of variability as to what Google will actually show, especially when it comes to the meta descriptions. We've seen those be like over 300 characters in some instances as well. Dates are incredibly important. And, I think we've seen in the past that just updating the date will cause a page to get crawled more often and have more opportunities to rank. But Google is looking at dates in a variety of ways, and they're trying to associate dates with pages because they care so much about freshness. So there's the byline date, the one you explicitly put in there. There's the syntactic date, which might be extracted from the URL or the title. And then there's the semantic date. Based on what you talk about in your page, can they derive a date there? And so it's really important that you keep the dates consistent. And, there's a variety of ways that you can test it, of course, right? You can play around with the dates to see how that impacts things. But again, I wouldn't necessarily recommend that as something that you do on an ongoing basis, because if Google doesn't trust your dates, they're not going to crawl the sites as much moving forward.
Yeah, make sure you do that significant update test first so you can figure out what that is.
Absolutely. Now, this is something that people were very tinfoil hat about for a really long time. The domain registration information that Google got as a registrar, did that impact how you can rank? And so what we're seeing here is that they have tracked when a domain was created, also when it expires. So they have an understanding of when a domain changes hands. Excuse me. And so, sorry, I'm not finding a matching context. So, first name. Feel free to use the screen. My Google Home is talking to me. Sorry, y'all. And so with this combination of information, like the domain registration information, the fact that they consider pages going back to 20 versions of it, if you're buying a domain that someone else owned and you're trying to use the value of it, I would actually recommend that you don't change ownership until you have changed the pages 20 times. And changing them 20 times. I'll need to add the name and number to Google Contacts.
They heard about us looking at the assistant features in the Google leak, and so now it's plotting its world domination.
So anyway, they what I would recommend is that if you're updating these, this is killing me. I would recommend.
Seriously, Google knows we're doing this right now, and they're trying to actually sabotage the information.
So yeah, what I would do is I would look to change pages in a very structured way over time. So if you're changing the design of the site, I would do that prior to the registration transfer. I would also look to, change the site systematically. So each page, let's say you're adding new paragraphs and you're adding new imagery and whatever, I would do those in step changes. So then by the time that you do change ownership, Google see okay, the site has already changed to whatever it was. So they're not going to discount whatever it is that you've done. So there's a variety of ways that you can test and see if this is actually worth doing. Obviously, I get that this is a pretty big undertaking, but if you're someone who's buying domains and just trying to capitalize on, other people's link equity and so on, you are probably someone who has the ability to make this sort of change to the site. This isn't the sort of thing that like an enterprise is going to do.
Right. Unless it's like a big domain or brand change that you're making the big move, like make sure you get it right first.
Yeah. Video sites are treated differently. So if 50% or so if more than 50% of your pages are video pages, they treat the site differently. They don't say how, but it's treated differently. And excuse me, what you can do to test this would be to no index the pages that aren't video pages, or a lot of the pages that are not video pages, and then basically change the composition of how Google is thinking about your site. And then you can see if that makes a difference to how your performance looks like in the SERP features. And, I would only do that if video was a really important thing to your business. Your money, your life is actually scored very specifically. It's not one of those like, abstracts that Google talks about and doesn't actually do things with. So as you can see here, they have classifiers specific to health and news. And then they also have what are called fringe queries. So we all know that Google sees, 15% of the queries every day are new queries. So they've got to figure out, leveraging machine learning classifiers, whether or not a query is YMYL. And so really, if you are not in the health space, not in the news space and so on, I would really look to avoid those queries, because there's just so much more that needs to be done. It's the higher bar of quality that they're looking for. And if you can't fulfill that, then you might as well just not do it. But if you are a site in these spaces, continue to invest in incredibly high quality content so that you don't end up losing out around these queries.
And look at them. If you don't know, like look at who is ranking, you can get a sense of whether it is like considered a YMYL in the eyes of Google, which is all that matters.
Yep. There's gold standard documents. So we talk a lot about the quality ratings guides, and I think they get somewhat ignored, at least by me. I don't know how everyone else is using them. And the reality is that Google is taking that data from the quality raters and then using that to inform training data for different classifiers and so on. And so really what we would want to do is make sure that the content that we're creating meets those gold standards. And so an easy way to do that would be with this content evaluation library that Elias Dabis, I don't know if that's how you say his name. He's the guy behind AdverTools, which is a Python library that's pretty popular in the SEO space. So he built a tool where you can just plug in an article title, plug in the text from the article, and then it goes through all of the different questions, or a good amount of the questions from the quality raters guidelines, and then tells you how well you stack up. So it's just a good way for you to have a feedback loop on what you might want to adjust, because the closer your pages are to these gold standard documents, the more of a boost that they're going to get in rankings in the downstream scoring functions. So embeddings are probably the most interesting thing going on in search to me. And one of the things that Google does, they develop embeddings for the entirety of the site, and then they compare pages for the site embeddings. Compare embeddings for the pages against the site embeddings to determine how on topic you are. And so this is really just an indication that you shouldn't be writing random content that's just upper funnel that has nothing to do with your business, because it's already at a disadvantage from ranking, because Google doesn't feel that you're an expert on those subjects.
Real quick, so if you want to learn more about site embeddings, Mike typically goes much more in depth in it. He wrote an article all about how content relevance is quantitative in the eyes of Google. So breaks that down, and a few other articles as well. I'll include that in the email follow-up to this webinar.
Yeah. And so I said this thing, I don't know if it's true at all, but
Backlash.
No, let me clarify what I'm saying here. So there is an attribute indicating whether or not a site is a small personal site. And the reason why I said that they may be torching small sites on purpose is because we've seen a lot of small sites get torched recently. And so what we know now is that they have these twiddlers that they could use with this attribute to boost small personal sites. And what we know is that they're not doing this. So, it may not be that they are purposely torching small sites, because again, we don't know what they do with this, but we do know that they are not going out of their way to give more value to small sites. And when you think about these big picture things that they're doing, using click data, using links, using content relevance, these are all things that big brands are going to have, more resources to drive, right? Like, you recognize a brand, you are more likely to click on it when you see it in organic search. You are a big brand, you have the resources to make really robust, relevant content. You are a big brand, you can afford to go after links, and links, again, are a function of brand and visibility. So, small sites are inherently very disadvantaged as it relates to this.
Real quick, we are almost at time. We might go a little over, so don't worry if you do have to leave. We're going to send the full replay of this to everyone when this is done.
Cool. Google's also looking at content effort. So they're scoring the effort of content. It could be related to large language model content, and we don't know because we don't have any access to the URL that's linked there. But I suspect that this is one of the things that they're using to attempt to combat the proliferation of content generated with things like ChatGPT. And they also have a measure here that basically is talking about how with Penguin you can't kill your own site with your internal links. And mentions matter a lot. There's a lot of mentions throughout the documentation. Nothing I saw indicated that mentions are treated as links, but mentions are a core component of how they're determining entity salience across the web.
Which happens a lot less. I was talking to Joy Hawkins. She was trying to do a local SEO study about mentions, and she said you can't find them anymore because everyone links mentions of brand names, for instance. So it's almost kind of esoteric in conceptually, unless you've got a bad SEO who's not linking what should be linked.
Googlebot is more capable than we thought. So I think in a while we mostly see it just doing GET requests, but it's actually capable of post, put, patch. These are all different things that are what are called verbs in the hypertext transfer protocol. And, they're not used a ton unless you are building something very specific. But it's just really interesting to know that Googlebot can effectively do anything that a browser can. And then they're also scoring the effort of user-generated content. So from my eyes, I think it's worthwhile to test the removal of user-generated content to see if that improves the rankings of your pages. And here's what that test could look like. I mean, it could be as simple as blocking that the code that generates your user-generated content thing in robots.txt, and then seeing how it performs from there. Google also detects how commercial a page is, and so I think that is something that's used for determining what to show in the SERP based on intent. And so, I think this is a good example for you to take us through, Garrett, on Stanley Cup.
Yeah, it's so relevant because this is just perfect example of how search intent changes constantly. Just the other day, the Panthers won, the NHL Stanley Cup, which is the name of the trophy. There's also a very popular commercial like thermos mug of the brand Stanley that makes a cup. And so you could actually see, you go into Ahrefs and you can see the fluctuation over the last couple of weeks of people searching for Stanley Cup, looking for the NHL or looking for the insanely popular thermos. And Ahrefs has added a new search intent feature using AI that tries to identify it, but it doesn't do the traditional, navigational, commercial, informational. It's trying to go to what the actual page intent was. But I know, Mike, you have some ideas on what it should do in terms of ranking tools and search intent.
Yeah, that's a whole nother conversation for another.
Let's dive into what do you do. So we got a couple of slides that just talk about some of the strategies and tactics to focus on.
Yeah, I think the big thing is that SEO and UX need to work together like very closely. Again, nav boost being so important. You want to do things that keep people on your web pages. And your content needs to be more focused. You can't be expanding into all the things unless you do it in a really structured way. I'm a big proponent on, building out topical clusters. There's a variety of tools that really support keyword clustering at this point, but you can't just launch one page on a random subject and expect to like rank perfectly for all the keywords. You need to be doing it in a topical cluster standpoint so that you are not diluting what the site is typically already about. And then you also want to pay attention to what people are doing when they leave your site. So Google is, capturing all this data, whether it's from Chrome or them even being your internet provider before, right? Like they are leveraging all this information. And so you want to see where people go after they come to your site. You don't want them to be going back to Google so much. So in these examples here, 10% of the traffic that goes from the Atlantic from Google goes back to Google. I mean, 10% is not bad, but like it depends on, is that 10% clustered around like a small amount of pages? And those pages will likely not perform long term. We're seeing that 11% of people that leave New York Times go to Google, 3.5 of them go to Amazon. And so again, these are all just like giving you an indication of what's happening with the journey. And these are all things that you can get looking at SEMrush.trends or also SimilarWeb. And then the tactical changes, I mean, I think we walk through those, right? Like page title, so on and so forth. And then I would also encourage people to spend some time looking through these documents. These are insights that I've developed here. A lot of other people have been doing things as well. But, there may be things that you figure out that no one else thought about. And so we really give you a sense of what you can do with that. And I've basically been on a tour going through this stuff in a variety of different ways with a variety of different people. John Shahada and I looked at it from a news perspective. Joy Rand and I looked at it from a local perspective. And a lot of other people have been doing this as well. And I really encourage you to dig in to whatever is the most valuable to you. And also add on as you identify things that are valuable from your perspective too.
And finally, I mean, this has been awesome. We're at the end. Tomorrow, if you are not sick of the Google Leak and you want even more and you want to see Mike and Rand kind of go head to head with Amanda Natividad, Sparkturo is hosting an office hours that's going to go, continue to do that marketing perspective when it comes to the Google Leak value. So that's going to be a really great session. I'm definitely going to check it out. So highly recommend that you go and register for that.
Absolutely.
Finally, take it away.
Make great content. I know you don't want to hear me say that, but that's the reality. You know what I mean? Because what happens is the only way to do this at scale, like get users to continue to click and have a good experience, is make something that they want to click and have a good experience on. So, it really comes down to like, how can you create something that's better than what else is out there? How can you promote it so people know about it and effectively build a brand around what you're trying to do so that they recognize your brand and they know that you're the result that they need to click on and stay on. So I know people look at that as a cop-out, but like at the end of the day, if we're not trying to do this at scale, we're just looking for little hacks where we're not doing things that people actually want. And then those people don't stay on your website anyway. So the only content that you should be making should be at the intersection of what your audience personas want, your buyer personas want, and the expectations of Google and how it operates.
Bam. Mic drop. Buy his book. This is the guy, award-winning girl dad, also a girl dad. If you want to hit us up, here's our emails. I think we're a little over. Don't really have time for questions. I don't know if you want to take one. We got one or two that came in here, but
I don't have time for questions, but come to the thing tomorrow because we have a large space for questions and we can talk about that. Or you can just email you questions and I'll answer them via email.
There you go. Thank you all so much for coming. This has been so much fun. Like I said, next month we'll be doing one with Will Critchlow. We'll talk more experimentation. Hope you all have a great day. We'll see you at the office hours at Sparkturo tomorrow, and I'll send you the replay as soon as we get out of this. Y'all have a great Wednesday. Peace. Thank you, Mike.